There are moments in a reporter's life that stay with you long after the cameras stop rolling. Moments that remind you that beneath the headlines and the glamour, we're all just people trying to find our way. I've covered wars, presidential elections, space launches, events that shaped our nation's history. But there's one story I've never told on air, a story about a rainy October evening in 1955, a deserted train platform in Philadelphia, and a young woman who would soon become a princess, sitting alone on a wooden bench, crying into her hands. Grace Kelly was, at that moment, the most celebrated actress in America. She had just won the Academy Award. Her face was on every magazine cover from New York to Los Angeles, and in just 7 months she would marry Prince Rainier of Monaco and leave Hollywood forever. But on that particular night, she wasn't a movie star or a princess-to-be. She was just Grace, and she was lost. I wasn't supposed to be there, and she certainly wasn't supposed to be there. But sometimes the most important stories are the ones that find you when you least expect them. It was a Thursday evening, October 13th, to be precise. I remember because it was the same day the Brooklyn Dodgers had finally won the World Series, their first championship after so many years of heartbreak. The whole city of New York had been celebrating, and those celebrations had spilled down the eastern seaboard all the way to Philadelphia, where I found myself that evening. I had been covering a story about labor disputes at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, not glamorous work, but important. My cameraman, Bill Henderson, and I had finished our interviews around 6:30. We'd grabbed dinner at a little diner near the waterfront, corned beef sandwiches and coffee so strong it could strip paint, and then Bill had driven back to New York. He had a daughter's birthday party the next morning. I told him I'd take the train. The Pennsylvania Railroad had a late departure at 9:45. That gave me time to walk through the city, to think. I've always found that some of my best thinking happens in the quiet hours between assignments. So I walked through streets still wet from an afternoon shower, past row houses with their lights glowing warm against the October chill, past corner taverns where men gathered to relive the Dodgers' victory one more time. I arrived at 30th Street Station around 9:50. If you've never been there, it's one of those grand old terminals that makes you feel like you're stepping into a cathedral of American ambition. High ceilings that seem to touch the sky, marble columns thick as oak trees, the kind of place built when we still believed that train stations should inspire awe. But at that hour, on a Thursday night, it was mostly empty. The daytime rush had long since passed. The main concourse echoed with my footsteps. A janitor pushed a wide mop across the marble floor. A young couple sat on one of the long wooden benches, his arm around her shoulder, both of them dozing. A policeman stood near the information booth reading a newspaper. I checked the departure board. My train was on time, platform 7. I bought a copy of the Philadelphia Inquirer from a newsstand and made my way toward the platform. That's when I saw her. At first, I wasn't certain. She was sitting on a bench near the entrance to platform 9, her back to me. She wore a beige raincoat, belted at the waist, and a silk scarf covered her hair. Her posture was what caught my attention, the way she sat so perfectly straight, even in apparent distress. There was something about the line of her shoulders, the angle of her neck, that seemed almost choreographed. I walked a bit closer, not wanting to intrude, but curious. And then she turned her head slightly, just enough for me to see her profile against the platform's dim light. It was Grace Kelly. There was no question. I'd seen that profile 100 times, in Rear Window, in To Catch a Thief, in newspapers and magazines. But more than that, I'd met her once before, briefly, at a press event in Manhattan. This was 1955, remember, and Grace was everywhere. She'd won the Oscar that March for The Country Girl. Hitchcock called her his favorite actress. The whole country was in love with her. And here she was, alone in an empty train station at night. She was crying, not dramatically, not like an actress in a film, but quietly, the way people cry when they think no one is watching. Her shoulders shook slightly. She held a handkerchief, white linen I could see even from that distance, and she pressed it to her eyes every few seconds. I stood there frozen. Every instinct I had as a reporter told me to approach, to find out what was wrong. But something else, some deeper instinct about human decency, told me to leave her alone. This was private grief, whatever it was. I turned to walk away. Mr. Cronkite, her voice stopped me. It was soft, a bit hoarse from crying, but unmistakable. That patrician Philadelphia accent, refined and musical. I turned back. She was looking directly at me now. Her eyes were red, mascara slightly smudged. But even in distress, there was a composure to her that was remarkable. "I'm sorry," I said, taking a few steps toward her. "I didn't mean to intrude. I was just passing through." She smiled then, a small, sad smile, and gestured to the bench beside her. "Please," she said, "I could use the company. If you don't mind sitting with a mess of a woman." I hesitated only a moment before sitting down. I kept a respectful distance between us. The platform was quiet except for the distant sound of trains and the occasional announcement echoing through the station. "I recognize you from that press luncheon," she said, composing herself, dabbing her eyes one more time before folding the handkerchief neatly in her lap, "at the Plaza Hotel. You asked me about working with Bing Crosby." I was surprised she remembered. It had been a crowded event, dozens of reporters all vying for her attention. "You have a good memory," I said. "For faces, yes. For names, not so much." She laughed softly. "But I remember you because you asked about the work, not about my personal life. That was refreshing." We sat in silence for a moment. I didn't push. I've learned over the years that the best interviews happen when you give people space to speak in their own time. Finally, she said, "I suppose you're wondering what Grace Kelly is doing crying in a train station." "I suppose I am," I admitted, "but you don't owe me an explanation." "No," she agreed, "but maybe I owe myself one." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. She offered me one. I declined. She lit hers with a slim silver lighter, took a deep drag, and exhaled slowly. "I came to Philadelphia this morning," she began, "to visit my family. My parents still live here, in the house where I grew up. Do you know Philadelphia, Mr. Cronkite?" "A bit," I said, "mostly professionally. It's a wonderful city, proper, dignified, very concerned with doing things the right way." She said this with a mixture of affection and something else, weariness perhaps. "My father especially believes in propriety, in duty, in living up to one's responsibilities." She paused, drawing on her cigarette again. "I went home to tell them about Rainier, Prince Rainier of Monaco. We've been seeing each other. It's been in all the papers, of course, but I hadn't spoken to my parents about it directly, about what it might mean. I knew about the prince, of course. The whole country knew. The press had been following their courtship like it was a fairy tale come to life, the American movie star and the European prince. And how did they take the news?" I asked gently. Grace looked down at her hands. The cigarette burned between her fingers, forgotten for a moment. "My father asked me if I loved him." "That seems like a reasonable question." "It is. It's the most reasonable question in the world." She looked up at me then, and I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't expected, genuine confusion. "And I couldn't answer him, Mr. Cronkite. I sat in my father's study, in the house where I learned to walk and talk and dream, and I couldn't tell him whether I loved the man I'm planning to marry." She stubbed out her cigarette in the ashtray at the end of the bench. Her hands were shaking slightly. "Everyone keeps telling me what this means," she continued. "The studio says it's perfect publicity. My mother says it's a wonderful match. The press says it's a fairy tale. Prince Rainier is kind and intelligent, and he makes me laugh. Monaco is beautiful. I would never have to work again. I could have children, a real family life, away from all this madness. But," I prompted, "but I don't know if I'm doing it because I want to or because it's what everyone expects of me, because it's the next logical scene in the movie of my life." She turned to face me more fully. "Do you understand what I'm saying? I've spent the last 5 years becoming exactly what Hollywood wanted me to become. The cool blonde, the untouchable beauty, Grace Kelly, the princess of the silver screen. And now I have the chance to actually become a princess, a real one. And everyone's waiting for me to say yes, to step into that role just like I've stepped into every other role I've been given. But this isn't a role," I said quietly. "No, this is real life, and I don't know if I know how to live it anymore." The honesty of her words hung in the air between us. Here was this woman, this icon of American cinema, admitting that she'd lost herself somewhere in the process of becoming famous. "May I ask you something?" I said. She nodded. "If you could do anything, anything at all, with no one watching, no expectations, no cameras, what would you do?" Grace was quiet for a long time. A train pulled into one of the nearby platforms with a hiss of steam and brakes. Passengers disembarked, their footsteps and voices creating a temporary surge of life before fading away again. "I think," she said finally, "I would get on a train and just ride, pick a direction and go. Stop in small towns where nobody knows who I am. Have coffee in diners, walk down streets where I could just be another woman in a raincoat. Read books in the afternoon, sit in parks, be anonymous." "That sounds lovely," I said. "It sounds impossible," she corrected. "That's not the life I have. That's not the life I chose." "Didn't you choose it?" She smiled sadly. "I chose to be an actress. I chose to work hard, to be good at my craft. But I didn't choose to become this." The moment you become symbolic of something larger than yourself, you stop belonging to yourself. I thought about that, about how true it was, not just for her, but for anyone who steps into the public eye. "So what happens now?" I asked. She laughed, a genuine laugh this time, though still tinged with sadness. "That's the question, isn't it? I have a train to catch back to New York at 10:15. I have a breakfast meeting tomorrow morning with the studio. I have costume fittings next week for a film I'm not sure I want to make. I have a prince waiting for my answer. And what will you tell him?" Grace stood up then, walked a few steps toward the edge of the platform, and looked down the dark tunnel where the trains disappeared. I stood too, keeping my distance. My mother told me something this afternoon, she said, not turning around. She said, Grace, being a princess is every little girl's dream. Why are you making this so complicated? And what did you say? I said, because I'm not a little girl anymore. She turned back to face me, and I saw that she'd stopped crying. Her face was clear, resolved in some way I couldn't quite read. Mr. Cronkite, can I tell you something? Something I need to say out loud to another human being? Of course. I'm afraid, she said simply. I'm terrified, actually. Not of Rainier, not of Monaco, not of being a princess. I'm afraid that I'm about to make the biggest decision of my life for all the wrong reasons. I'm afraid I'm choosing it because it feels like an exit, an honorable exit from Hollywood, from the pressure, from having to be Grace Kelly all the time. She walked back to the bench and sat down. I joined her. I had a conversation once with Cary Grant, she continued. We were filming To Catch a Thief in the south of France. Between takes, we'd sit on the terrace and talk. He told me that the hardest part of being a movie star wasn't the fame or the pressure. It was the moment when you realize you've become so good at performing that you can't remember how to just be. He said he sometimes looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the person looking back. That sounds lonely, I said. It is. It's the loneliest thing in the world. And I'm standing at this crossroads trying to decide. Do I keep performing in Hollywood, or do I start performing as a princess? Either way, I'm performing. Either way, I'm not really Grace. The station clock showed 9:50. Her train would be arriving soon. Mine had already left. I'd missed it without even noticing. You want to know what I think? I asked. She looked at me with those incredible blue eyes. Please, I think you're asking yourself the wrong question. You're asking whether you should marry Rainier, whether you should become a princess, whether you should leave Hollywood. But maybe the real question is, who is Grace Kelly when she's not performing? She sat with that for a moment. Then she said something I'll never forget. My father asked me if I loved Rainier, and I couldn't answer. But I'll tell you what I didn't say. I said, I don't know, Dad. But what I wanted to say was, I don't know how. I don't know how to love someone when I don't even know who I am. It was one of the most honest things I'd ever heard anyone say. A train whistle sounded in the distance. Her train approaching platform 9. I should go, she said, but she didn't move. What are you going to do? I asked. She smiled, a real smile this time, tired but genuine. I'm going to get on that train. I'm going to go back to New York. And then next week, I'm going to fly to Monaco. You've decided then? No, she said, I haven't. But I've decided something else. I've decided that maybe it's okay not to know. Maybe I don't have to have all the answers before I take the next step. Maybe I just have to be honest with myself and with Rainier about where I am. The train pulled into the platform with a great rush of steam and noise. Doors opened. The conductor called out, New York, Pennsylvania Station. Grace stood and gathered her things. She retied her scarf, composed herself with that remarkable grace that was her trademark. Then she turned to me and held out her hand. Thank you, she said, for sitting with me, for listening, for not treating me like Grace Kelly. I shook her hand. Who did I treat you as? As Grace, she said simply, just Grace. She started toward the train, then stopped and turned back. Mr. Cronkite, if you ever tell this story, and I suppose someday you might, will you do me a favor? What's that? Tell people that I wasn't crying because I was sad. I was crying because I was trying to find my way home. And sometimes you have to cry a little to see the path clearly. I didn't board a train that night. I sat on that platform for another hour, thinking about what Grace had said, about performance and authenticity, about the roles we play and the selves we lose. Eventually, I caught a midnight train back to New York. I never told anyone about that conversation. Grace had trusted me with something real, and I wanted to honor that trust. 7 months later, in April of 19, Grace Kelly married Prince Rainier in what the press called the wedding of the century. I watched it on television like millions of other Americans. She looked radiant, composed, every inch the princess, and I wondered if she'd found her answer. I like to think she did. I like to think that in the years that followed, in her life in Monaco and her children and her work with the Red Cross, she found some version of that anonymous life she dreamed about. Not completely, of course, but maybe she found moments, quiet moments, real moments. I saw her one more time years later at a charity event in New York. It was night. She'd aged beautifully, gracefully. There was a contentment in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She recognized me across the room and came over. Mr. Cronkite, she said, it's been a long time. Your Serene Highness, I replied. She laughed at that. Please, I'm still just Grace. We chatted for a few minutes about nothing in particular. Then, just before she moved on, she leaned in close and whispered, I found it, you know, what I was looking for that night. Did you? I asked. It took a while, and it wasn't what I expected. But yes, I found it. I'm glad, I said, and I was. I truly was. Grace Kelly died in September 9th in a car accident on the winding roads of Monaco. She was only 52 years old. When I heard the news, I thought about that October night about the young woman crying on a train platform trying to find her way home. I've thought about it many times over the years, about the courage it takes to be honest with yourself, about how we all perform in one way or another, trying to live up to what others expect of us, about how rare it is to find moments of true authenticity. That's what I remember most about Grace Kelly. Not the movies, not the princess title, not the glamour. I remember a woman brave enough to admit she was lost, brave enough to say she didn't have all the answers, brave enough to cry in a train station and then get on the train anyway. We could all learn something from that. I know I did.